It's okay not to be okay, but I promise I'm trying, by rayrae118. Chapter 12. Things changed a bit after that. The rest of July went by in a haze of visits from friends, Quidditch games, and of course more studying. Neville got to have a nice talk with his grandmother, who for once didn't spend the whole conversation comparing him to his father and complaining that he didn't match up. It seemed that his initiative to involve her in this secret with Sirius Black had changed something in the formidable dowager. Indeed, though she didn't know how to express it, she truly was proud of the way he'd stood up for his father's friend, and she was willing to allow him to gain a closer relationship with the fugitive, though hopefully he wouldn't be one for much longer. Neville had also spoken to her about Harry, where he went into a little more detail about his friend's childhood, though not sharing too much as he didn't want to betray Harry's trust, ending with the request he had made to get more information on his godmother. Augusta was shocked, even more so when she learned that Harry hadn't even known whom his godmother was before this summer. She couldn't help but think that, had things just been a bit different, Harry and Neville might have grown up as brothers. She used to feel disappointment towards her young heir, but the change this summer had wrought was a complete 180. Neville was going over to Harry's new home nearly every day now, and the result was a more confident young man. He told his grandmother the two of them were studying and just talking, and that Sirius had been sharing a lot of stories about their parents. He even told her that he was getting more comfortable on a broomstick. Augusta wanted to meet the boy who had changed her grandson so much. If Harry was able to do this, she had no doubt that he had to be a rather special young man. Molly had spoken with Minerva, and after hearing the whole story, was shocked that Dumbledore would be so inattentive. She offered her former professor her full support. Things were a little tense when she also learned the infamous murderer Sirius Black was also in residence, but when she learned that truth as well, she mellowed. Seeing him again was nerve-wracking, but Sirius was well enough that at this point he didn't really look like he'd spent 12 years in prison on the run at all. He was funny, charismatic, and charming, and any computations the Weasley matriarch had about her children spending time at the McGonagall castle completely vanished. They seemed to bond a little over their desire to be a parental figure to Harry. She remembered him from the Order of the Phoenix during the war with Voldemort. She and Arthur were several years older, and though they hadn't been very close, she had enjoyed spending time with him, as well as Lily, James, and Remus. She had never really warmed to Peter, and now she knew why. Susan was becoming a regular presence in the McGonagall household. She enjoyed spending time with Harry and Neville, especially Neville, and she too was enjoying getting to know Sirius. Especially seemed as if the man might become a permanent fixture in her life, if her aunt had anything to say about it. As her parents had been much older than him, he didn't have too many stories. They had been in their 7th year when he had started at Hogwarts. Most of what he knew from them came from the few years after graduation, when they had been members of the Order of the Phoenix together. He did, however, tell her a lot about her aunt. Amelia had apparently been a few years ahead of him in school, but when he joined the Auras, she had been one of the training volunteers, as she had only finished her training a couple of years earlier. They had enjoyed a rather light, flirtatious relationship that also had the hints of being something more, had they had the time and the events not unfolded the way they had. Harry enjoyed getting to know her as well. He remembered the events from his 2nd year quite well, and how most of the Hufflepuff had shone him, and thinking that he had been the one to petrify Justin. But Susan had never said a bad word against him. One afternoon in July, he finally asked her why. Susan shrugged a little sheepishly. "You seemed just as scared as the rest of us," she explained. "I didn't think you'd do anything to hurt anyone. Though I am sorry I never really fought for you against my housemates. Besides, your mum was a Muggleborn, as is one of your best friends. Why would you have any sort of vendetta against them?" Harry smiled and nothing more was said on the subject, though he definitely felt closer to the girl after that. He was enjoying making new friends, and felt that Susan could be a lifelong one. Hermione had left with her parents on holiday to Spain. They would be gone for about 2 weeks, but Hermione promised she'd be back by Harry's birthday. Harry was very glad for that, because it would be the first time he'd actually be able to celebrate it with his friends. He didn't want a huge affair, but somehow he knew Aunt Minerva and Sirius would be going all out. They still maintained that they wanted to spoil him rotten. Harry was glad that Ron and Ginny were also at the castle a lot, though Ron was a lot more reluctant to study than the rest. Surprisingly, after a comment from Harry on how impressed Hermione would be if she came back and all his summer assignments were complete, was enough for Ron to buckle down and hit the books. Ginny had given the black-haired boy a knowing smirk, but Harry had just smiled in return. He may be a boy, but he wasn't clueless. Ron had told him that he was invited to attend the Quidditch World Cup with his family. His father had managed to get tickets, and even his oldest brothers would be there. Harry was excited, but also saw the look in Neville's eyes at the mention of the match. He knew Neville would not be going, as his grandmother was not a fan. The opportunity to do something about that arose a few days later. Neville hadn't been able to come over, as his grandmother had asked him to do something at home, and Ron had used some improper language in front of his mother, so it was just Susan and Ginny that day. Later in that afternoon, Amelia showed up, spending some time just cuddling with Sirius on the sofa. Harry entered the room nervously and was pleased that, at least, they weren't snogging. Amelia, do you have a minute? He asked hesitantly. The two adults sat up straighter and Amelia nodded. Of course, Harry. Is something wrong? Harry shook his head as he sat down in the armchair across from the pair, twisting his hands together in his lap. I just wanted to ask you something. Susan mentioned that you were going to get tickets for the Quidditch World Cup. I was hoping you could coordinate with Mr. Weasley so we could all sit together. Amelia nodded thoughtfully. She would certainly be able to do that. I don't see why not, she agreed, smiling, how he and her niece had become such good friends. Harry shifted in his seat. I was also wondering if you might be able to get an extra ticket. Neville's not going, and I know he's disappointed at that. I was hoping you could get one for him as well. I can pay for it, he hurried to add, but was cut off when Amelia shook his head. I will get him a ticket, but I'm not letting you foot the bill, she smiled. Neville's a nice young man, and I'd like to do it for him. We'll call it a birthday present. How about that? Think you can keep it a secret until then? Harry nodded, grinning. Thanks, Amelia. This means a lot to me. Both adults smiled at the charitable young man, though that expression changed to embarrassment at the next minute, when his eyes took on a devious glint. Now, I'll let you two get back to whatever you were doing. And remember, Padfoot, don't do anything I wouldn't do. He hurried out of the room before they could yell at him. He was still laughing to himself when he found Ginny waiting for him at the foot of the stairs. He gulped nervously, wondering if she had heard. Apparently she had, but she wasn't disappointed. She just gave him a gentle hug, smiling as she stepped back. That was a nice thing you did, Potter. Harry returned the smile, and the two headed back to the library. I know how much he wants to go, and I didn't want to have to ask your dad if he could get one more ticket. I know Amelia's got some more pull, and I don't think she's actually gotten hers and Susan's yet. Ginny nodded her understanding and promised to keep quiet, as the two entered the library and sat down next to Susan, returning to their respective books. Harry's birthday was a quiet affair, or as quiet as it could be with Molly Weasley involved. She and Minerva had had a bit of an argument when it came to the food, with the Professor finally relenting and letting Molly bring the cake. The house elves were quite eager to take care of the rest of the meal. It seems they had grown quite fond of her new charge and wanted to make his birthday the best ever. Not that that would be much of a challenge. Minerva had been hard-pressed to hide her laughter, and Sirius hadn't even tried, as he watched the excitable creatures interrogate Harry on his favourite foods. Hermione returned the day before and was there, looking very tan. Ron and Ginny came along with their parents, Fred and George as well. Mr. Weasley and the twins had been informed of the situation and promised to keep it all a secret. Fred and George were awestruck the moment they learned that Sirius Black was Padfoot and they'd actually spent a year being taught by Moony. Remus was also there. It had taken some doing and a stern talking to from Minerva when she informed him all those empty bedrooms were just going to waste, and quite a bit of pleading from Harry before he consented to move in. But only temporarily, and he drew the line at Minerva buying him his own new wardrobe. Still, he couldn't deny how happy Harry was in his new home. When Minerva and Sirius informed him what had happened at the beginning of the summer, he had to take a few moments just to ensure he wouldn't do something rash, like hex one on Uncle Vernon Dursley to an inch of his sanity. They had continued to talk, telling him their theories on why Dumbledore had left him there, and why the Leader of the Light had done absolutely nothing at the evidence of obvious abuse. He included the old man in his thoughts of hexing. He didn't want to believe they were telling him the truth. Not of the man who had made Hogwarts education possible for him. But listening to their theories and hearing Harry's explanation of his first few years at Hogwarts, he couldn't really come to a different conclusion. Suddenly, Dumbledore's request for him to not try to contact Harry before he came to Hogwarts made a lot more sense. Susan and Amelia were there as well, and so were Neville and Augusta. Neville had invited him over for dinner the night before, and he just wanted a quiet celebration at his home. He had been surprised to receive so many gifts, but Susan, Ron and Ginny all sent him gifts, and Harry had given him a Muggle book on plants, which Neville seemed to revere, especially after seeing the glossy, coloured photos on the pages. Augusta was pleased to finally meet Harry and seemed impressed by the young man. On a bit of a whim, Harry invited her over to come with Neville to his birthday party the next day, which he had graciously accepted. Minerva watched the gathering with a proud smile. As they were trying to keep their situation quiet for as long as possible, she hadn't invited any of her colleagues to come, though she reserved that idea for next year. She wanted to show off her new charge. She knew that Phileas and Pomona would definitely be surprised in the coming September. Severus probably would be as well, but not in a good way. She sometimes wondered why Albus had hired him. He was really hindering a whole generation. The number of eligible Aurors and Healer candidates had decreased dramatically since his appointment, as fewer and fewer could meet the OWL and NEWT requirements. Tibby and Miller, her two head house elves, had set up a rather impressive spread outside on the edge of the Quidditch pitch, under a tent to provide some shelter from the sweltering July sun, as if it's cold right now. The adults sat in the shade and watched their children fly around in an impromptu game. The teams were a little bit uneven, with Ron playing keeper on one end and Hermione on the other, though she tended to lurch in the other direction whenever the quaffle came towards her. Harry and Ginny made up one set of chasers, and Neville and Susan made up the other. Fred was a beater on Harry's team, and George played beater for Neville's. The air was filled with shouts and laughter as the adults looked on, smiling at how much fun the children were having. Around lunchtime, the children all descended rapidly and fell upon the food with a ravenous fervour. Mrs. Weasley had truly outdone herself with the cake. It easily could have fed twice the amount of people present, and had a miniature Harry done in frosting flying around the top in pursuit of a tiny frosting golden snitch. Harry's eyes almost bulged at the pile waiting for him. Were all the presents there? Aunt Minerva and Sirius were doing their best to undo years of lessons beaten into him by the Dursleys. But Harry didn't think he'd ever get used to people spending so much on him, or people wanting to spend anything on him. Hermione gave both him and Neville their presents, since she hadn't been able to send anything from Spain. Harry couldn't wait to read dueling techniques for the Master, while the 3 gardening pots she had brought back for Neville from Spain really intrigued him. They were very pretty, with the Spanish patterns, and they would look quite lovely in Neville's greenhouse. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley gave him a book on wizarding lore and a tin of homemade fudge. They had collaborated with Minerva a bit to make sure it wasn't a book he already owned, but they thought he might like it, considering what his godfather had been through. Fred and George's present impressed Harry as he pulled out some homemade joke products. He knew they were really interested in opening their own joke shop, but he hadn't realised they were so far along. He gave them a searching look, and they just winked. Ron's gift of chocolate frogs was typical and reassuring. So many things were changing in Harry's life. It was nice to see something predictable. Susan and Amelia had given him a faux glass and the Aura handbook. Harry wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life, but being an Aura was definitely a contender. Especially after learning his father had been one, and his grandfather, Charles Potter, had been one of the most celebrated heads of the DMLE in the last 500 years. His death at the hands of a Death Eater raid was what had given Barty Crouch Sr. his rise to the top. Neville and Augusta had presented Harry with a thin, handwritten volume that left Harry speechless. Turning the pages, he discovered the book to be a journal written by Neville's mum. A few pages in, the handwriting began to change in certain places, and Harry realised this book was a collaboration between Alice and his mother. There were some recipes he thought might be potions the 2 women had created themselves. A picture was stuck in between 2 photos, 2 of the pages, and Harry pulled it out, a lump in his throat as he looked into the smiling faces of Alice Pruitt and Lily Evans. They must have been in their 3rd or 4th year, and were clearly best friends. Harry looked up, eyes shining as he thanked the Longbottoms fervently. Augusta just gave him a gentle smile and nodded, but Neville looked like he understood completely. Remus's gift also brought a few tears to his eyes. The stuffed dog, wolf, and stag animals looked rather worn, and Remus told him how he had managed to collect them from the house at Godric's Hollow, and kept them all these years. He had wanted to give them back to Harry, but wasn't sure if there were anything to be desired. Harry loved Ginny's present as much as Neville's, though part of it was probably just because she had given it to him. Ginny had woven him a friendship bracelet, using predominantly green and red thread. The significance of the colours was not lost on both Sirius and Minerva, though Harry didn't seem to get it. She had gotten a little charm attached to it. The miniature Snitch's wings actually fluttered a little bit. The hug Harry gave Ginny was definitely noticed by all the Weasleys, who made vows to figure out just what it was about. Surprisingly, Ron just smiled at the closeness the two seemed to have. He had talked with Ginny and was happy with her answers. That didn't mean he wanted to see them snogging anytime soon, but he knew Harry would treat her right. Once he had opened all the presents from his guests, there was still a sizable stack left. He was almost silent as he unwrapped the gifts from his guardians. As Sirius hadn't been able to actually go shopping anywhere, he had asked one of Minerva's elves to visit Gringotts and retrieve some money, which he then gave to Minerva to help cover the costs. It was time to start spending that Black family fortune, and in ways his parents would definitely not have approved of. Harry was in awe by what he received. Several new books on defense and transfiguration, Quidditch pads, a carrying case for his firebolt, a new perch for Hedwig that would match all the furniture in his room, an arm holster for his wand, and perhaps the best gift, a certificate that promised him a trip to a wizarding eye doctor. He looked confused at this, but that changed to a grin when Minerva explained, "There's a new procedure that's just come out that can fix eyesight. It's not well known, as it is very new, but it's perfectly safe, and you will not need to wear glasses again." Harry thanked everyone for their thoughtful presents, before he once again dragged everyone away to the Quidditch pitch for a rematch. It seemed that Neville and Susan did not like to be beaten 100-30. It was probably helped that Harry and Ginny had Ron as a keeper on their team. He actually had some practice. As the party began to break up, Amelia gestured for Neville's attention so that she could present her own gift to him. He looked at the ticket with confusion. Amelia smiled. "I had an extra ticket to the World Cup, and I thought you might enjoy it. It's in the same box as the Weasleys, so we'll all be together." Harry looked at Ginny. Neville looked at Harry, who was beaming. Mr. Weasley had fielded a few questions from his children, indicating they had, in fact, coordinated so they could all sit together. Neville then looked at his grandmother, her austere nod indicating that she had already been consulted and had given her approval. Amelia was a long-time colleague, and her niece seemed to be growing into a mature and responsible woman. Neville mouthed a thank you to Harry, knowing that he probably had something to do with all of this. Once most of the guests had left, Amelia gave Harry his second present, and told him of how her investigation had uncovered multiple accounts of fraud and embezzlement by one Vernon Dursley. She had handed over her evidence to the Muggle authorities, and they had made the arrest the day before. The company he had been working for, Grunnings, were quite pleased to be informed of what an employee had been up to. She decided, however, not to tell him about the money that he had also given for his care. She didn't want him to have to deal with the knowledge that they had effectively been stealing from him. Harry just kept smiling as everyone left through the fireplace until it was just him, Sirius, Remus, and Minerva once more. "Did you have fun?" Sirius asked, smiling. Harry just gave him a hug, and when he stepped back, he moved over to hug Minerva and Remus as well. They all watched smiling as he headed up to his room. It was truly great to see a happy Harry Potter. It made them all feel like they were making a difference. Albus Dumbledore entered his office and let out a sigh of contentment, happy to be home after a rather harrowing few weeks at an ICW conference in Japan. He glanced around the room, taking in the sleeping portraits, the overflowing desk, Fawkes asleep on his perch, the instruments puffing away in the corner. Albus frowned, going over to investigate that corner more closely. Most of the instruments were still working, but there were two that had stopped. Both instruments were used to monitor one particular student. The one in front dealt with the wards on Privet Drive, while the second monitored Harry's health and magic levels. Albus's eyes widened in alarm as he set down the bag he had been carrying and immediately disapparated to Surrey. There appeared to be nothing wrong on the outside, but no one answered the door when he knocked. Albus furrowed his brow in confusion. "Are you looking for the Dursleys?" Albus turned around, suddenly thankful that he had had the foresight to transfer his purple and silver robes into something Muggle-appropriate. Well, Muggle-appropriate had he been visiting the neighbourhood 50 years ago. He nodded as he made his way back down the walk. "Yes, I was. Have they taken a family trip for the day?" Mrs. No. 6, who had always disliked Petunia for her nosy habits, never mind that she was much of the same way, sniffed. "I should think not," she said haughtily. "That would be quite the to-do. Yesterday morning a constable showed up and arrested Vernon." Albus's eyes widened. "Can you tell me the charges?" he asked urgently. If the police were involved, the chances of him getting Harry to come back here were slim, though theoretically the wards could still be replicated, just as long as he lived with his aunt, and as long as he didn't stop thinking of the place where Petunia dwelled as home. Mrs. No. 6 leaned forward as if she was sharing a secret. "The rumour is he was embezzling funds from his company, and get this, from his own nephew. We were all told that boy was no good criminal with not a penny to his name. Turns out his relatives were giving a monthly amount of money to care for him, and they spent not a pound on him. So horrible. I wish I could apologise to the boy. He hasn't been seen around here for weeks. Not since the first week of summer, I think." Albus numbly walked away, barely able to give the woman a farewell. The idea that Harry Potter had not been seen for weeks was troubling. The monitor on his health was not working was also worrying. That device would only stop working if Harry was dead or behind some very powerful wards. Only a Fidelius or the wards surrounding some of the older ancestral homes could interfere with his monitor. He also had to wonder how they had found out about the money given to the Dursleys. Dumbledore had authorised a monthly payment of £500 from the Potter estate for Harry's upbringing. He had known it hadn't been used as such, but had considered Harry's treatment here the cost of safety. For the greater good. Arriving back at school, he looked around somewhat helplessly. He didn't have anyone he could talk to right now. He could ask Morley if she knew anything, and if not, to keep an eye out. He would also send a note to Minerva asking for a moment of her time as soon as she was able. But other than that, the only thing he could do right now was to wait until September the 1st, and hope that Harry was on that train. End of chapter 12. I loved that birthday party. Dumbledore better watch himself. Things are starting to get interesting. This story is quite significantly a Dumbledore basher. I like Dumbledore as a character, but he's a very easy man to turn into either a good character or a bad character, depending on who's writing about him. Hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you have a really good day, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Bye!